So I had my first gender-affirming surgery yesterday, which was a hysterectomy. And today it's really starting to hit me that this actually happened. This thing that I have been wanting so much for more than 2 decades now is finally real.
What's up, y'all? It's GC Kinsey, here to talk about my gender-affirming hysterectomy. Part 3. I had a hysterectomy, which was my first gender-affirming surgery in December of 2023. That's why my voice sounded so different in that clip from the hospital. And now, at a 1.5 post-op, I'm making a series of videos where I answer your questions about what that whole experience was like. This video is the 3rd part in the series. Part 1 was about why I wanted this surgery. Part 2 was about finding a surgeon and doing all the pre-op preparations. This part is about the surgery itself. And part 4 will be about recovery and life on the other side. Go check out the first 2 parts if you haven't already, especially part 2 because this part might not quite make sense without it. And look for the final part to drop next week. Once all 4 parts are up, they'll be linked in the description, but for now, I want to get into part 3 and talk about the process of having this surgery. First things first, this is your official warning that I will be talking about a surgical procedure in detail, so there will be discussion of pain, bodily fluids, reproductive organs including genitalia given the nature of this surgery, and unfortunately there will be mentions of gender dysphoria and transphobia as well. If any of that is not your cup of tea, I totally understand, and I've got a bunch of other videos you can watch instead. I also want to give a disclaimer that although I will be talking about medical things, I am not a doctor or any kind of medical professional. I'm just sharing my personal experience as a patient. With all that out of the way, let's get started with this question from Ilya's Odyssey 9626 on YouTube. I would like to know what surgical method was used. My surgery was performed laparoscopically, so instead of making a big incision and opening me up, they made 5 tiny incisions where they could insert all the surgical tools and a camera, did the whole procedure internally, and then pulled the uterus and the other abdominal scar tissue they were removing out through the vagina. That's the very short answer, but what I want to do for the rest of this video is give you a play-by-play of what my surgery and stay in the hospital was like. In the previous video, I mentioned that I had to do a bowel clean out before surgery, so that was all completed the night before, and I also couldn't consume anything by mouth after midnight. The surgery was scheduled for 9 a.m., but I had to arrive at 6 a.m. for final pre-op stuff. So I got up around 4:45 and took a shower with Hibiclens per my pre-op instructions. Then I got changed into clean clothes and my driver picked me up and took me to the hospital. So a couple of things about that. First of all, my gynecological surgeon said that she usually does hysterectomies as an outpatient procedure from her clinic, but in my case, she was performing the hysterectomy and another surgeon was taking scar tissue out of my abdomen and off my digestive tract. So because of that, I had to have the whole thing done in a hospital and then stay there overnight for observation, plus as long as it took me after that to prove that I could poop. Fun times. And second, yes, you do have to have a driver anytime you're going to be under anesthesia, inpatient or outpatient. And no, they don't let you use something like a taxi or a rideshare that just drops you off and bails. It has to be someone who's agreed to be responsible for you and stay nearby for updates. Finding a driver for a gender-affirming surgery can be difficult because yay, transphobia. It can also be challenging if you live alone and usually drive yourself everywhere. I had both of those things working against me, and the other issue I faced was that most of the people in my support network had jobs where their schedules wouldn't work for being my driver. The only person who was available was a relative who's retired, but who's also unfortunately not supportive of my transition, so I thought, well, I am having this scar tissue removed at the same time, I just won't tell my relative about the hysterectomy portion of this surgery. Don't do this, y'all. Learn from my mistakes. Because apparently, despite HIPAA existing, it is very difficult to get every single person who will be involved in your care at a hospital to guarantee that they won't mention your hysterectomy to your driver. I was advised to put it in my chart and tell every single person I saw individually not to say anything. Also, what the staff didn't tell me was that because I'd put that in my chart, they wouldn't be giving my driver the usual midway updates of out of surgery, in recovery, going up to a room that they gave to all the other drivers, which ended up freaking my poor relative out. Aside from that whole miscommunication, I was also really scared that even if no one on staff spilled the beans, I would when I was still coming up from anesthesia or loopy on painkillers. So yeah, when I had top surgery a year later, that was the biggest thing I did differently. I started putting out feelers early for friends who worked odd hours or had flexible schedules, and found someone who was available to drive me and supportive of my transition. Anyway, tangent aside, back to surgery day. I arrived at the hospital at 6 a.m. and on the ride over, I was finally allowed to have one last thing to drink. An Ensure shake they gave me at my pre-op appointment the week before. I was supposed to wait as long as I could after midnight to drink it, but also make sure it was finished before 6 a.m. The Ensure pre-surgery shake is a clear liquid that's designed to pass all the way through you before your operation, and it just gives you a little carb and hydration boost beforehand since you're on an empty stomach. Once I got to the hospital and checked in at the front desk, it was only about 15-20 minutes before a nurse came and took me back to the perioperative area to start preparations. She took my vitals, gave me one last chance to use the restroom before I got changed into a gown, and then I got on a stretcher bed in this little curtained off area where for the next 3 hours there was a parade of people coming by to set up different things. 2 other nurses came by to review my medical history and start an IV. Yet another nurse put a bed sore prevention patch on my lower back, which is kind of like a gel pack thing that sticks to the skin. And she also prepped the surgical area by trimming my stomach hair with clippers. And one more nurse got all the heart monitor stuff hooked up. By the way, I was also hooked up to a blood pressure cuff and pulse oximeter this whole time. An assistant from each of the 2 surgeons' teams brought me consent paperwork, verified that I understood everything that was about to happen. The forms were pretty short, about a page and a half each, and they just listed all the details of the surgery and any risks and complications that could happen. So I had to read and sign them, and then the assistants had to sign as witnesses. I also got to talk to each of my surgeons ahead of time, mostly as just a chance to say hi, but also to ask any last minute questions. And after talking to them, that was when my nerves finally started to settle. Like literally, I could see my blood pressure dropping on the monitor, because both of my surgeons were just super chill, had great bedside manner, and brought really positive, calming energy into the room. I got to meet more of their assistants as well. One of my gynecological surgeon's assistants asked if I wanted to see photos from the surgery, and I will always geek out over the chance to see my own organs, so I was like, hell yeah. The last person I talked to was the anesthesiologist, who asked a bunch of questions about my history with anesthesia and sedation, whether I'd ever had any issues with it, whether anything in my mouth could chip or break. And I remembered something I'd learned from my ENT surgeon when I got my tonsils out, which was to always mention to anesthesiologists that I'm a singer and to just be extra careful with the vocal cords during intubation. So I said that, and the anesthesiologist was like, cool, we were already going to use our smallest tube size anyway, so that worked out perfectly. And after that, all I had to do was wait. Things got delayed by almost an hour, so I started getting nervous again waiting that long, but I just did slow, deep breathing exercises to stay as calm as I could until they finally came and took me to the operating room. They had me scoot from the stretcher bed onto the table, gave me some oxygen through a mask, and I didn't even have a chance to start counting backwards before I was out like a light. I woke up back on a stretcher bed in a recovery bay area sort of thing. Basically like a long hallway with a bunch of loopy, moaning, freshly operated on patients in a row against the wall. And the first thing I heard was a nurse saying, "Your surgery's done." They got out everything they were supposed to get out, which was a massive relief. But I'm not gonna sugarcoat it, y'all. Immediate post-op pain hurts like hell. We're talking a solid 9, almost 10 on the pain scale, which I'm gonna pop on the screen for context. This is the one my hospital used. And of course I was getting very strong narcotic pain medication through my IV, but that only dulled it a tiny bit. Every so often the nurse would ask what my number was, and it hung between 8 and 9 for quite some time. The worst part was that most of the pain was concentrated in the vaginal region, which not only made me hyper aware of my vagina existing, which made me dysphoric, but also wasn't great considering my past medical trauma. But I just kept reminding myself, this is temporary, it's only going to get better from here, and I did more of those deep breathing exercises while squeezing the handrails of my stretcher to get through the worst of it. The nurse said my pain needed to be around a level 4 or 5 before I could be taken to a room, and I was getting pretty frustrated that it kept hanging around 8. But what finally turned the corner was when that one assistant from my gynecological surgeon's team came over and was like, "Hey, I got something to show you." And it was a photo of my uterus outside my body where it finally belonged. And when I saw it, the nurse said, "That's the first time you've smiled since you got out of surgery." My pain dropped from an 8 to a 6 pretty quickly after that, and then to a 5, and finally 4. So then the nurse was like, "Dang, we should have shown you that picture earlier." Who's to say whether that actually helped or whether that's just when the pain meds finally happened to really kick in, but either way, I do feel like, mentally at least, seeing that photo made a huge difference, because it gave me a surprising amount of gender euphoria in the midst of all that pain. Now that I was finally stable, the nurse called a transport team to take me up to my room. And when I got there, I noticed it was right around 5 p.m. The clock had said 9:50 a.m. when they finally wheeled me back to the OR, and I was curious how much of that time I'd spent in surgery versus recovery. When I asked about it later, I was told that the surgery was done before noon, so I was apparently in recovery for 5 freaking hours. It had maybe felt like 45 minutes to an hour for me, which just goes to show you that time gets weird when you're in pain and on drugs. Once I was in my room, I was finally reunited with my relative/driver, so that's when I kept telling myself, don't mention the histo, don't mention the histo, because I was still quite loopy. The nurse on shift for my floor came by to introduce herself, and an assistant for the surgeon who'd taken out my abdominal scar tissue came by with some post-op instructions. I asked my relative to step out while they were there so I could have some privacy to mention the histo. The best part of the post-op instructions was that I could order dinner, because at that point it had been almost 17 days since I had last been able to keep down any solid food due to that scar tissue, so having it gone and being able to eat a meal I could actually chew made me so happy I cried. I did have to ask the nurse and my relative to help me read the menu when I called the cafeteria though, because the painkiller I was on was Dilaudid, which makes words swim on the page for me. So after the nurse saw that, she made a note in my chart about getting me switched to oxycodone so I wouldn't be as high. And after I ate some delicious chicken pot pie for dinner, I did indeed get switched to oxy. My pain stayed around a level 3 to 4 from that point on, so I was stable enough that my relative could swing by my house and feed my hamster and then go home for the night. And since I could finally see words again, I was able to text all my friends and coworkers and let them know I'd made it out of surgery. Then I started reading Heaven Official's Blessing while I waited for my body to produce a turd so I could leave. I'd been warned that that could take up to 4 or 5 days, so I brought several volumes of the novel with me. The post-op instructions also encouraged me to walk around to get things moving, so when a new nurse came on duty for the night shift, I asked her what all I needed to do to get unhooked enough to go for a stroll down the hall. And that was when I became aware of my catheter. My gynecological surgeon had warned me about that, so it wasn't a surprise, and she'd promised to place it after I was already knocked out so I wouldn't have to have any memory of that. And I literally didn't notice it was there the whole time until I stood up and felt the tube bumping my leg. The nurse emptied out the bag and hung it on my IV pole so I could walk, and she also briefly disconnected my IV so I could put my binder on, because no way in hell was I leaving the room in just a hospital gown with titties flopping in the breeze. I'd asked her if binding immediately post-op was okay, because if it wasn't, my plan was to just pace back and forth in front of my bed, but fortunately she said that any kind of compression helps with post-op swelling. While I was walking, I realized that standing was much better than sitting because it took all the pressure off my abdomen and crotch where I was the most sore. So I went back and forth down the hall over and over until I had no more energy left, and then I tried to get some sleep, which if you've ever stayed in a hospital overnight, you'll know is impossible. You will be constantly woken up by people bringing you meds, taking your blood, giving you updates. You might get 2 to 3 hours of consecutive sleep at most. I also had trouble sleeping because once I became aware of my catheter, I constantly felt like I had to pee. The nurse came back around 5 a.m. to take it out, which involved a test to see if I could keep it out. Basically, she pumped a bunch of saline into my bladder and said that if I could pee out 500 cc's, I wouldn't need a catheter anymore. And side note about catheter removal for any of y'all who may be concerned about that, especially if you're on T and have bottom growth, it does not involve any touching downstairs. I told the nurse, look, I'm trans, like, how do we make this as not terrible as possible? But she was just like, oh, no, it's fine, and pulled the catheter out from a safe distance of several inches away from my body. I was able to pee, 500 cc's and then some, and while I was in the bathroom, I noticed that I had on this sort of mesh underwear with a bloody pad and a now warm ice pack in it, which I guess they must have put there before I woke up from surgery. So I took out the ice pack and changed the pad to a fresh one, and I realized this is the last thing resembling a period that I will ever have. So that was exciting enough, but then I also pooped. Just a tiny bit, but the nurse immediately noted it in my chart so that I could hopefully be discharged as soon as possible. While I waited for confirmation, I ate some more, walked some more, read some more, pooped some more, and my pain stayed around a level 3 to 4, so all in all, it was a pretty chill morning for being in the hospital. The one frustrating thing that happened was when the day nurse came for shift change and the night nurse was giving updates, she kept misgendering me even after the day nurse and I both corrected her. And she was far from the only person who misgendered me while I was in the hospital, but she was the most disappointing. Because one, she knew I was there for a gender-affirming surgery, and two, she'd seemed like such a good ally with helping me get my binder on and being so cool about the catheter removal, so yeah, guess you never know who you can trust. But the day nurse was the same one I'd had the previous afternoon, and she was a super strong ally. Like, she actually wrote a reminder about my pronouns on a sticky note because apparently the computer system didn't really show it in a prominent place on patient charts. And she helped remind the CNAs and lab techs so it didn't all fall on me. She also resolved a mix-up where the pharmacy kept trying to get me the same kind of birth control pills that I had taken to stop my period until this nurse finally got them to understand, like, no, he doesn't need it anymore. So all of that helped balance out the other thing. In the afternoon, an assistant for the surgeon who'd taken out my abdominal scar tissue came by and verified that I could indeed go home since I'd pooped. So my day nurse started getting all the discharge paperwork together. I had a meeting with a separate discharge nurse, virtually on an iPad that was brought to my room to go over final post-op instructions. The day nurse brought me oxycodone pills from the hospital pharmacy and took out my IV. And then I got dressed, packed all my stuff, and called my relative to come pick me up. So from the time I arrived for surgery to the time I left, I was only in the hospital for about 36 hours. My gynecological surgeon actually called me the next morning and was like, I'm at the hospital doing rounds and you're not here. They told me you already went home. But she was really happy to hear that I was recovering so well. She was also super apologetic about the injury that happened during surgery, and I was just like, wait, what injury? Apparently, when she pulled my uterus out and the other surgeon pulled all the scar tissue out through the vagina, one of the tools they used tore the vagina a little bit and scraped the perineum, so they had to repair it. Which I guess explains why that whole region was so sore when I first woke up, but I literally never would have known that happened. I thought that was just the expected amount of pain. And by the time she called, which was about 48 hours after surgery, it barely even hurt anymore, so she was really relieved to hear that. I also thanked her again for helping to coordinate everything and make it possible to have both surgeries I needed in one, and told her how much better I felt mentally now that my uterus was out, how much relief and joy and gender euphoria it was already bringing me, which she said was the best news she could have hoped for. So that's how my surgery went, and on that sappy note, now is where I'm going to wrap up part 3 of this retrospective and turn the conversation over to you. Thank you again to those of you who sent me questions. I'll be answering the rest of them in part 4, so look out for that video next week. And in the meantime, if you have any additional questions, thoughts, advice, experiences you want to share, then drop a comment below and let's get a discussion going. You can also reach out to me on other social media. I'm GC Kinsey across all platforms. And while you're here, feel free to check out some of my other videos. I've got more vlogs like this one about my experiences as a queer person. I've got cosplay music videos, cosplay tutorials, a whole bunch of cool resources for singers about voice changes on testosterone, and more right here on this channel. So make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss anything new. And with that, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for all of your support. Happy Pride Month, and I will see you on the next one.